Hey everyone, my name is Lizzie, and today we'll be talking about how bakers and home brewers are one in the same. So, is there really a difference between baking bread and making homemade alcohol? The answer is not much. There are many similarities between both, and I'll name you 4 components of each. Number one, they both need sugar. However, I must admit that you put a lot more sugar when you want to make alcohol because the sugar is eaten by the yeast. And the goal of the yeast is to just ravage through all the sugar, and the more sugar it eats, the more alcohol percentage you'll get at the end. Therefore, the yeast's goal is to just find all the sugar that's present inside your jar and just like rip its head off. By sugar, you can use brown sugar, yellow sugar, white sugar, any type of sugar really, any type of food with sugary content, such as barley, you can use hops, and there are many other types of sugar, but at the end, I'll tell you the exception to the rule. As for baking, you use a lot less sugar because the goal of the yeast is not to eat the sugar. The yeast is just there for the texture of the bread. So you'll notice that when the bread rises in the oven, this is because the yeast is eating the sugar and it's producing CO2. So the CO2 in alcohol terms, you will see it in form of the airlock bubbling, and in terms of baking, you'll see it with the bread rising. So that's the second component. Both of them need yeast, and based on the recipe that I use for home brewing, I use 1 teaspoon of yeast for 1 gallon or 5 liters of alcohol. And for a loaf of bread, they use 2 teaspoons. So it's double the amount of yeast. And this would make sense because in the alcohol land, the yeast just roams fluently in its liquid, eating all the sugar. However, when it comes to bread, the yeast, it has to ravage through all the flour, eggs, and all the batter. It's harder for it to dissipate within your bread. By the way, if you weren't aware, you can even use bread yeast to make alcohol. The difference is that you might not get 20% alcohol, but you can still get a decent 5, 10, 15, depending on the bread yeast that you use. And the taste will be the same. I've tried it in one of my first batches and I am satisfied with the taste. And as for the length of the fermentation, I would leave it for 2 to 4 weeks as well. And for all these tips and tricks, there are links in the description below. You can book a class and we'll guide you step by step to help you in your alcohol making process. If you have any questions about baking, we'll be there to help as well. But preference is on home brewing. Going back to baking, since we mentioned that there was sugar and yeast, does this mean that there's alcohol in your bread? Well, the answer is no, because you don't add that much sugar into your bread. You add a certain amount and the alcohol percentage would be so low it's barely even noticeable. In alcohol, the lowest amount of sugar that I've added is 900 grams of sugar for 1 gallon. And this might seem like a lot. It's just to give you an example, it's almost 1 whole pack of yellow sugar. And you just don't drink that. You don't put that in cocktails. All this sugar is not translated into the final product because a lot of it, or almost all of it, gets eaten by the yeast. It gets transformed into alcohol. So it's not as sweet as you think. And it's good to note that the speed of your fermentation that does not depend as much on the quantity of sugar, but more on the quantity of yeast. There's an experiment that was conducted online and they found that the more yeast they added into their home brewing, the faster the fermentation went. But one caveat to this is that if you want your fermentation to be done super quickly, you add a lot of yeast. Yes, it will finish quickly, but the taste won't be as good. So it's going to compromise on the taste. You don't want your alcohol to taste like yeast. You want it to taste like smooth alcohol. And for that reason, the alcohol that I tend to use these days is the EC 1118. And that gives me sort of wine, cider type of alcohol taste. Anything else is not really to my palate. I would accept any other yeast recommendations if you have any. So drop a comment below if you suggest other types of yeast that are beneficial to your homebrewing experiments. So if we go back to the similarities between baking and homebrewing, they both need sugar, they both need yeast, and third, they both need a base. So what do I mean by base? I mean a sort of liquid to flow in. The bread will need milk, so you can't just have flour, sugar, and expect it to make bread. And it's the same thing for alcohol. So you can't just put sugar and yeast and expect the yeast to eat the sugar. No, it needs context. It needs an environment that's soothing, that's encouraging for the yeast. And this is where water comes in. So water is to yeast like oxygen is to runners. Therefore, you want to add water and you want to make sure there's water, because if there's too much sugar, the yeast gets stressed, like there's too many things to eat and it's not in the favorable environment, and this might lead to off flavors, meaning that the alcohol won't taste as good as a finished product because of the stressed yeast. Yeast, little parenthesis, is one of the main components of the taste of your alcohol. Contrarily to what other people believe, it's not the sugar, it's not the flavoring, a lot of it is the yeast. So for those who bought turbo yeast in the past, you might have off flavors, or for those who use too much yeast, you might smell or taste more yeast than you'd like. Going back to the base, you can also use juice because juice has water in it. I would not suggest using milk because you're fermenting in room temperature for 2 to 4 weeks, and who leaves milk outside for that long? Therefore, water with sugar or juice is the way to go. I have yet to try grape juice. That's one of the juices I'd like to try to make alcohol with. If anyone has tried grape juice, let me know in the comments below. How close to wine does it actually taste like? If you prefer sweeter wine, you just have to add more sugar. If you prefer dry wine, less sugar, the better. So the amount of sugar will determine your alcohol level, because the more sugar you add, the stronger your alcohol is gonna be. And if you add so much sugar that the yeast can no longer make more alcohol, that's when the sugar influences sweetness. So let's say your yeast has already produced 15 to 20% alcohol and it's at its maximum capacity. Even if you add more sugar, it's not going to go up to 30% alcohol. It's just going to affect the sweetness because there's no more potential alcohol that the yeast can produce. And this depends on every yeast package. So some yeast can produce up to 10%, others can produce up to 20%. It depends on the yeast strains that are in the package. Now, the fourth similarity is that baking and homebrewing both need heat. As I was mentioning earlier, 26 degrees is the optimal temperature for homebrewing, but no one bakes bread at 26 degrees Celsius. No, you would blast the oven to 230 degrees Celsius and leave it there for 13 to 15 minutes, depending on how you like your bread. When the inside of the bread reaches 55.5 degrees Celsius, the yeast will start to die. Therefore, the yeast eating the sugar, producing the CO2, so the rising bread will not go forever. It stops at one point. Your bread will not rise till the end of your baking time. Once it's 60 degrees Celsius inside your bread, that's when all the yeast starts dying off. And this happens at roughly 50% of your baking. Therefore, after 50%, the bread doesn't tend to keep rising and rising because there's no more yeast to eat the sugar. However, there are still some sugar left over. Although in terms of homebrewing, the goal of the yeast is to finish all the sugar. It wants to eat it all because you want to produce the most alcohol possible. If you can make a stronger batch, why not? And the more sugar that's eaten by the yeast, the more alcohol percentage your alcohol will have until that maximum limit of the yeast. So at the beginning of the video, I mentioned a little caveat. So there's one type of sugar that will not increase your alcohol level. So let's say your alcohol produces up to 15% alcohol and you're just at 7. And you like 7% alcohol. You say, I want 7% alcohol and I do not want 8%. So what do? Let's say you taste it, drink. It's not as sweet as I would like. Therefore, you want to add sugar, but you don't want it to go to 8%. So you can add non-fermentable sugar. And what this is, these are sugars that cannot be eaten by the yeast based on their chemical composition. And the yeast just roams around it. It doesn't make more alcohol. It doesn't make the alcohol percentage stronger. The non-fermentable sugar will just make your batch sweeter. And this includes stevia, Splenda. Just watch out for Splenda because it might leave you an aftertaste of Diet Pepsi. If that's something that you don't like, I would suggest using other types of non-fermentable sugar. And if you want a video on the role of sugar in fermentation, drop a comment below and let me know. Now, a fifth comparison between baking and homebrewing, so this is a bonus, is that when you want to make alcohol, you deal with anaerobic fermentation. This means that there is no oxygen involved. That's why you put everything in a jar, close up the lid, put the airlock in it, and let it do its work. However, when you're baking bread, this is not anaerobic fermentation, but aerobic fermentation, meaning there's a presence of oxygen during the fermentation or during the baking process. When it's in the oven, you see all the airs flowing around, and this enhances the bread making experience. So those were the similarities and differences between baking and home brewing, and I say if you're able to bake bread, you're able to make alcohol as well. If you found this video valuable, share it with a friend. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.